My name is Emily Carter, and 2 days after my parents were buried, my brother threw me out of the only home I had ever known. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He simply changed the locks and left my belongings sitting in the rain, like garbage, on the front lawn. When I called him, shaking confused, still wearing the black dress from our mother's funeral, he said something I will never forget. Dad made it clear a long time ago. Sons inherit the family. Daughters move on. Then he hung up, just like that. 30 years of being his sister, reduced to a cardboard box on wet grass. What my brother didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that my mother had been quietly preparing for that exact moment. For 7 years, 7 years of private meetings with a lawyer, 7 years of paperwork no one in the family knew existed, 7 years building something my brother would never see coming. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just surprise him. It nearly destroyed him. But before I tell you what happened the day we sat down for the will reading, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this, stories about family betrayal, and the quiet ways karma finds its way back, are exactly what we share here. And I promise you, what happened in that lawyer's office changed everything. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your own family look you in the eye and treat you like you were nothing? Because that's exactly what my brother did. What he didn't realize was that the house he kicked me out of was never really his to begin with. And that was only the beginning of what my mother had planned. To understand why my brother was so certain the house belonged to him, you have to understand the kind of family we grew up in. We were the Carters, a respectable, middle-class family living in a quiet town just outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My father, Frank Carter, owned a small construction company. Nothing huge, but big enough to give us a comfortable life. A 2-story house, a wide backyard, and a garage workshop where my father spent nearly every weekend building something. Tables, shelves, decks for neighbors, things like that. But in my father's mind, the most important thing he ever built was my brother, Daniel Carter. Daniel was 6 years older than me, and from the moment he was born, my father believed he was the future of the family. I don't think Dad ever meant to be cruel about it. He just believed something very simple, something he repeated so many times growing up that it almost sounded like a family motto. Sons carry the legacy. Daughters? Well, daughters eventually belong to someone else. So our childhood followed that belief almost perfectly. When Daniel turned 16, my father bought him a used pickup truck and started teaching him the business. They spent weekends together, measuring lumber, visiting construction sites, and talking about contracts and clients. When I turned 16, my father asked if I could help my mother more around the house, cooking, cleaning, running errands. And the strange thing is, I didn't question it back then. It was just the way things were. My mother, Margaret Carter, was the quiet center of our family. She had this gentle way of smoothing over the sharp edges in our house. If my father dismissed something I said, she would squeeze my shoulder when he wasn't looking. If Daniel bragged about one of his business ideas, she would quietly ask me later about my day. She never argued with my father openly, but somehow she made the house feel softer, safer. When I graduated high school, I told my parents I wanted to become a nurse. I still remember that dinner, the 4 of us sitting around the kitchen table, my acceptance letter folded neatly beside my plate. Daniel had just finished talking about a new real estate investment my father was helping him with. When it was finally my turn to speak, I slid the letter across the table. I got accepted into the nursing program at Temple, I said. My mother smiled instantly, but my father barely looked up from his plate. Nursing, he said. Then he shrugged. That's a fine job for a woman. Not a congratulations. Not a single question. Just that. A fine job for a woman. Daniel laughed and raised his glass. Well, at least someone in this family will know how to take care of us when we get old. Everyone chuckled except my mother. Later that night, she knocked softly on my bedroom door. She sat on the edge of my bed and held my hands in hers. Her palms were warm, her voice quiet. I'm proud of you, Emily, she said. More proud than you know. Then she said something that didn't make much sense at the time. One day, everything will make sense. I remember asking her what she meant, but she just smiled. The kind of smile mothers give when they know something their children don't. At the time, I thought she was simply comforting me. I had no idea that earlier that same afternoon, she had driven 2 hours to Philadelphia and walked into a law office I had never heard of. That was the first meeting, the first signature, the first quiet step in a plan she would spend years putting into place. But back then, none of us knew how important those meetings would become. Life continued. Daniel expanded into real estate with my father's help. I worked part-time jobs to pay for nursing school, and my mother kept our family balanced the only way she knew how, quietly, patiently, holding everything together, until the day everything started to fall apart. 2 years before my parents died, my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, stage 3. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing a shift at the hospital. My father's voice sounded different, short, tired. "Your mother's sick," he said. "You should come home. Not we need you. Not please. Just, you should come home." And without hesitation, I did. I packed my things, moved back into my childhood bedroom, and began caring for my mother full-time. Chemotherapy appointments, doctor visits, long nights when the pain wouldn't let her sleep. I was there for all of it. Daniel visited 3 times that entire first year. 3. Each visit lasted less than an hour. He would walk in wearing expensive suits, glance at his watch, kiss Mom on the forehead, and then disappear again. At the time, I told myself he was busy, that his work was demanding, that family meant different things to different people. What I didn't know then, what I would only discover much later, was that during those same months, my brother was barely visiting our mother. She was quietly preparing a future he never saw coming. And when that future finally arrived, it would change everything. For almost a year and a half, my life followed the same quiet rhythm. Hospital appointments, medication schedules, long afternoons sitting beside my mother while she slept. Cancer changes the atmosphere of a house. Everything becomes softer, quieter, like the whole world is holding its breath. Some days my mother felt strong enough to walk slowly through the backyard. She loved that garden, especially the lavender she planted years earlier. The scent always made the whole yard feel calm, peaceful. On those better days, she would sit in the sun with a blanket over her knees and ask me about my work at the hospital, about the patients, about the little victories that kept me going. But sometimes she would grow strangely thoughtful, almost distant. One afternoon stands out clearly in my memory. It was late spring, warm. The lavender had just started to bloom. My mother asked if I could drive her into Philadelphia. She said she had some paperwork to take care of. Insurance things. Nothing important. We arrived at an old brick building downtown. She asked me to wait in the car. The meeting took nearly an hour. When she came back outside, she looked lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. I asked if everything was all right. She smiled. "Yes," she said quietly. "Everything will be." At the time, I believed her. I believed everything would eventually go back to normal. But life rarely moves in the direction we expect. About 6 months later, my mother finished chemotherapy. Her doctors were hopeful, cautiously optimistic. For the first time in nearly 2 years, our family allowed ourselves to breathe again. My father even suggested we visit my grandmother one weekend. She lived about 2 hours away, a small town near the Delaware River. My mother loved those visits. She always came home happier, lighter. So one Saturday morning, my parents left early. They promised they would be back before dinner. I remember standing in the driveway, watching their car disappear down the street. Neither of us knew it would be the last time I ever saw them alive. That afternoon, a truck driver fell asleep behind the wheel on the interstate. The police told me later that the collision happened in seconds. They said my parents didn't suffer. I don't know if that's true. I only know that by evening, both of them were gone. The funeral took place 4 days later. A small Episcopal church not far from our house. Friends came, neighbors, some of my father's business partners. Daniel stood at the front of the room beside the casket. He gave the eulogy. For nearly 8 minutes, he talked about my father, about the business, about hard work, about the legacy he had built. He mentioned my mother only once, just one sentence near the end, as if she were a footnote in the story of his life. I remember standing there, feeling strangely invisible, like the years I had spent caring for her had somehow disappeared. After the service, people gathered outside the church, offering condolences, sharing quiet conversations. That was when Daniel pulled me aside. His voice was calm, businesslike. "Emily," he said, "we need to talk about the house." The words felt cold, practical. Too practical for a day like that. "What about it?" I asked. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You'll need to move out by the end of the week." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "Move out? The house belongs to me now," he said. "Dad made that clear years ago." I stared at him. "We haven't even read the will yet." Daniel gave a short laugh. "The will is just paperwork. You know how Dad felt about these things." Then he said the sentence that would echo in my mind for months afterward. "Sons inherit the family." He straightened his jacket. "You should start packing." The conversation ended there, but the real shock came 2 days later. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital. It was raining lightly when I pulled into the driveway. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I tried my key. It didn't work. I tried again. Still nothing. That's when I saw the boxes stacked beside the garage. My clothes, my books, my nursing school diploma, everything I owned packed into damp cardboard. Through the living room window, I could see Daniel's wife, Laura, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. She noticed me standing outside. Our eyes met, and instead of looking embarrassed, she simply raised her glass slightly, as if she were toasting. Then she turned away. I stood there, in the rain, for a long time, before calling my brother. He answered immediately, like he had been waiting. "The locks are changed," he said, before I could speak. "You should pick up your things tonight." "Daniel," I said quietly, "that's my home." "No," he replied. It was. Then the line went silent. I sat down on the wet grass beside the boxes. The rain soaked through my coat. My hands were shaking. That's when I found it. A small envelope tucked between 2 old photo albums. My name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a single letter, and at the bottom of the page, a name I had never seen before. Attorney Michael Bennett, and one sentence that would change everything. "When the time comes, trust him." I didn't open my mother's letter right away. For several minutes, I just sat there on the wet grass, holding the envelope in my hands. The rain had soaked through my coat. My belongings were scattered around me in damp cardboard boxes. And the house behind me, the house where I had grown up, was suddenly no longer mine. At least that's what my brother believed. Eventually, I stood up, gathered the boxes I could carry, and drove to the only person I trusted enough to call, my friend Diane. She was a senior nurse at the hospital where I worked. Older than me, calm, practical, the kind of person who always seemed to know what to do when life fell apart. She opened the door before I even finished knocking. One look at my face, and she didn't ask questions. "Come inside," she said softly. "You're staying here tonight." Her apartment was small but warm, a simple place, filled with the smell of coffee and laundry detergent. And for the first time since my parents died, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Later that evening, sitting at her kitchen table, I opened my mother's letter. Her handwriting looked slightly shaky. Cancer had done that to her during the worst months of treatment. But the message was clear. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I always feared might come. I know your father and your brother, and I know how easily you could be left with nothing. Please contact Michael Bennett at Bennett & Gray in Philadelphia. He has the documents you will need. Everything is prepared. Everything is protected. And most importantly, remember this. You were never a burden, not for a single moment of your life." I read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Everything is prepared. Everything is protected. Prepared for what? Protected from whom? The next morning, I called the number listed under Michael Bennett's name. His office scheduled an appointment for the following afternoon. Philadelphia felt different from the quiet town where I had grown up. The law office stood inside an old stone building downtown. Tall windows, polished floors, quiet hallways that smelled faintly of old books. Michael Bennett was a man in his early 60s. Gray hair, measured voice, the kind of person who listened carefully before speaking. When I told him my name, he nodded slowly. "I've been expecting your call, Emily." My heart skipped. "You knew my mother." "For several years," he replied. "She was a very thoughtful woman." He gestured for me to sit. Then he said something that immediately raised more questions than answers. "There are certain things I cannot discuss until the official reading of the will." My stomach tightened. "So there is something." Mr. Bennett gave a small, careful smile. "Your mother made several arrangements that required time and discretion." "How long?" I asked. He opened a folder on his desk. "About 7 years." 7 years. The number echoed in my head. 7 years of meetings. 7 years of planning. 7 years of something happening behind the scenes, while the rest of us lived our ordinary lives. "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked quietly. "Because," he said gently, "some plans only work if no one knows about them." Then his tone became serious. "There's something very important you need to understand. Between now and the will reading, you may receive pressure from your brother." "Pressure?" I asked. He folded his hands on the desk. "Offers, requests, documents that seem simple enough to sign. But whatever happens," he paused for emphasis, "do not sign anything." I promised him I wouldn't. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice sounded unusually friendly. "Emily," he said, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened." That alone felt suspicious. Daniel rarely thought about everything. "I want to make things easier for both of us," he continued. "How?" "I'm prepared to offer you $15,000. The number hung in the air. "In exchange for what?" I asked. "A simple agreement," he said smoothly. "You sign a document confirming you won't contest Dad's estate, and the money is yours immediately." $15,000. For a moment, I imagined what he must think of me. Desperate, broken, easy to push aside. "You really believe that's fair?" I asked. Daniel sighed impatiently. "Emily, be realistic. Dad's will is clear. You'll walk away with almost nothing. This is just me trying to help." I thought about the boxes in the rain, the locked door, Laura raising her wine glass through the window. "No," I said. There was silence on the line. Then Daniel's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," I replied. "But I'll see you at the will reading." The call ended, and for the first time since my parents died, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity. Because somewhere behind all of this, behind the locked doors and the offers, and the quiet warnings from the lawyer, my mother had been preparing something my brother clearly didn't know about. And very soon, we were all going to find out what it was. The will reading was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock, at Michael Bennett's law office in Philadelphia. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I didn't want to walk in with Daniel. The conference room was quiet. A long wooden table, 6 chairs, sunlight falling through tall windows that looked out over the street. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to steady my breathing. Then the door opened. Daniel walked in first, perfectly dressed, calm, confident. Behind him was his wife, Laura. She didn't even look at me. Instead, she took out her phone and started scrolling, as if this entire moment were just another appointment on her calendar. A few minutes later, my grandmother arrived. My mother's mother, Helen Carter, 81 years old and sharper than anyone else in the room. She walked straight over to me and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly. Then Michael Bennett entered and closed the door behind him. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Today, we will be reading 2 separate wills." Daniel frowned. "2? "Yes," Mr. Bennett replied calmly. "Your father's will and your mother's." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well, that shouldn't take long," he said. Dad's wishes were always pretty clear. Mr. Bennett opened the first folder. "Let's begin with the will of Frank Carter." The room grew very still. Mr. Bennett read through several pages of legal language before reaching the distribution of assets. "To my son, Daniel Carter, I leave 70% of my remaining financial assets in business holdings." Daniel nodded slightly. Exactly what he expected. "To my daughter, Emily Carter, I leave 30% of my remaining financial assets. Daniel glanced at me with a faint smile, the kind of smile that says, "See, I told you so." Laura leaned toward him and whispered something that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Mr. Bennett closed the folder. Daniel spread his hands. "Well," he said, "that settles that." But the lawyer didn't respond. Instead, he calmly reached for the second folder. "That concludes your father's will," he said. "Now, we will read your mother's." Daniel waved a dismissive hand. "My mother didn't have any real assets. Everything came from my father." Mr. Bennett looked directly at him. "That is not entirely correct." Daniel's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" The lawyer removed a single sheet of paper from the folder. "Before we address the assets," he said, "your mother asked that a letter be read aloud." My throat tightened. Mr. Bennett began reading. "To my children. If you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone, and the moment I feared has arrived. I love both of you, but love does not mean blindness. For many years, I watched this family operate under a belief I could never fully change, that sons deserve more, that daughters should simply accept what they are given." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Bennett continued, "Emily spent 2 years caring for me during the most difficult time of my life. She was there for every doctor visit, every treatment, every night I could not sleep." Daniel visited 3 times. "This letter is not written to punish my son, but to explain the choices I have made." The room was silent. Even Laura had stopped looking at her phone. Mr. Bennett placed the letter down carefully. "Now we will discuss the estate of Margaret Carter." Daniel cleared his throat. "Like I said, she didn't really own anything." Mr. Bennett slid a document across the table. "Actually, she owned the house." Daniel froze. "That's impossible." "The house was transferred into Margaret Carter's name 5 years ago," the lawyer explained. "A legal protection strategy related to a potential business liability." Daniel grabbed the document and scanned it. His face slowly drained of color. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "My grandmother spoke for the first time. Your mother never transferred it back." Mr. Bennett looked at me. "And according to the will," he said calmly, "that property is now owned entirely by Emily Carter." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The house, the same house my brother had thrown me out of. 2 days after our parents' funeral. Laura sat up suddenly. "Wait," she said. "That house is worth at least $600,000. Mr. Bennett nodded. "Approximately." Daniel stared at me, his expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. But the lawyer wasn't finished. "There is also the matter of an irrevocable trust." Daniel blinked. "A what?" 7 years ago, Mr. Bennett explained, Margaret Carter established a trust with Emily Carter as the sole beneficiary. My grandmother folded her hands calmly. "The initial funding came from a gift I provided." Daniel looked at her in shock. "How much?" Mr. Bennett checked the document. $300,000. Laura gasped. "But due to long-term investment growth, the trust is now valued at approximately $900,000. No one spoke. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy. Daniel looked like someone had just knocked the ground out from under him. But Mr. Bennett lifted one final document. "There is one more item." Daniel's voice came out hoarse. "What now?" "Margaret Carter also held a life insurance policy." He paused. "The beneficiary is Emily Carter." Laura whispered the number before he even finished. 400,000. And suddenly, the quiet confidence Daniel had walked into that room with was gone. For several seconds, no one in the room said a word. Daniel was staring at the papers in front of him, as if they were written in another language. The house, the trust, the insurance policy, one piece after another, everything he thought belonged to him, had quietly shifted somewhere else. To me, Michael Bennett cleared his throat gently. "For clarity," he said, "let me summarize the total assets now belonging to Emily Carter." He glanced down at his notes. The house on Maple Hill Road, currently valued at approximately $600,000. The irrevocable trust, valued at roughly $900,000. The life insurance policy, $400,000. He paused for a moment. "And 30% of your father's remaining liquid assets." Daniel's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Laura's voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's almost $2 million. Mr. Bennett nodded calmly. "Approximately." The number seemed to echo through the room. $2 million. I sat there trying to process it. My mother, the woman who grew vegetables in the backyard and wore the same watch for 20 years, had quietly built a future for me that I never knew existed. Across the table, Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "It is not," Mr. Bennett replied. "My mother would never—" "She absolutely would," my grandmother said firmly. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Linda knew exactly what she was doing. Daniel turned toward her in disbelief. "You helped her do this?" "I helped her protect her daughter," my grandmother answered. Laura suddenly stood up. "This is insane," she snapped. "She's a nurse. She works 12-hour shifts, cleaning up after patients. And now she walks away with $2 million. Her voice was trembling. Anger. Fear. Maybe both. Michael Bennett watched her carefully. "Mrs. Carter is there. Something you would like to add?" Laura hesitated. Then the words spilled out before she could stop them. "You have no idea what this does to us," she said. "We were counting on this inheritance." Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Laura." But it was too late. "The investments didn't work out," she continued quickly. "We lost almost $350,000 last year." The room went completely silent. Daniel's face had turned pale. My grandmother leaned back slowly in her chair. "So that's why she murmured." Daniel slammed his hand against the table. "Stop talking." But the truth was already there. Out in the open, the expensive suits, the confident attitude, the certainty that he deserved everything. It had all been built on one assumption, that our parents' money would save him. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me. For the first time since I walked into the room. "Emily," he said quietly, "you have to help me." The words felt strange coming from him, almost unreal. "We're family, family." The word lingered in the air between us, and suddenly I remembered everything. The locked door, the cardboard boxes, the rain, Laura raising her wine glass while my things sat outside. "You threw me out of my own home," I said softly. "You told me I was nothing but a burden." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I was under pressure. I didn't mean half of what I said, but you said it," I replied. "And you believed it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly. "We can fix this," he said. "You have enough money now. You could help us get back on our feet." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. I thought about the long nights, sitting beside my mother's hospital bed, holding her hand, listening to her breathing slow and steady as she slept. I thought about the letter she left me. "You were never a burden, not for a single moment of your life." I took a slow breath. "I'm not going to let my brother become homeless," I said. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly. But then I continued. "That doesn't mean I'm responsible for the life you built." His expression hardened. "So that's it. You just walk away with everything." I shook my head gently. "No, Daniel. You're walking away with exactly what you earned." The room was quiet again. I stood up and picked up my bag. Michael Bennett nodded respectfully as I passed. My grandmother followed me toward the door. Behind us, Daniel remained seated at the table, staring at the documents that had just rewritten his entire future. As we stepped into the hallway, my grandmother touched my arm. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said softly. "Not because of the money, but because after everything, I had finally learned something she had been trying to teach me my whole life. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop allowing people to treat you like you are worth less than you truly are." When we look at stories like Emily's, it's easy to focus on the money, the house, the trust, the life insurance. Nearly $2 million changing hands in a single afternoon. But from a psychological point of view, the real story was never about the inheritance. It was about something much deeper. For decades, Emily grew up in a family system built on a quiet belief that one child mattered more than the other, that one child deserved opportunity, while the other was expected to sacrifice. Family psychologists call this entitlement conditioning. When someone grows up hearing that they deserve more simply because of who they are, they rarely learn the skills that truly sustain a life. Empathy, responsibility, accountability, and when reality finally challenges that belief, the fall can be devastating. But Emily's story teaches us something equally important. Sometimes the people who love us most protect us in ways we never see until much later. Her mother didn't just leave her money. She left her freedom. Freedom to walk away from people who treated her like she was less. Freedom to build a future without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. Not revenge, not wealth, but the quiet power of knowing your own worth. Now I'm curious about you. If you were sitting in that lawyer's office that day, what would you have done? Would you have helped Daniel? Or would you have walked away like Emily did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this make you reflect on family choices and the unexpected ways karma finds its way back, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Revenge Water Story, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that truth always finds its moment.